Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a Repensar el Futuro Digital.
Good morning and welcome to this virtual forum organized by the World Bank on rethinking the digital issues. We have experts from throughout the world who are going to examine digital development in Latin America and the Caribbean. The pandemic, which has so affected the region, has also identified one of the great levels of disparities in our societies, and that is the digital divide or gap. I am Josefina Townsend. I'm a journalist, and I'm going to moderate this discussion. I'm doing it from my home in Lima via this virtual platform, just as all my other colleagues. And this is possible thanks to our internet connections. This is something that has excluded half of the families in the region. So we have with us Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, Vice President for Latin America and Caribbean in the World Bank. And he is leading the response by the World Bank to the crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. This also, we have forums like this one so that we can rethink our issues, especially in the midst of this healthcare crisis that is affecting all of us. We also have with us Franz Dries Gross, who is Director of Transportation and Infrastructure from the World Bank. Franz has been a sector leader for this in Latin America, the Caribbean, and he's going to provide us with some final thoughts and comments at the end. So let's begin the discussion focused on three segments linked to various aspects associated with digital technology. First of all, you have broadband access to digital technology to all. Also expand access to digital financial services, and the expansion of technology in the realm of education. In each area, we're going to be talking to two experts who we will introduce a little later. I'd like to take this opportunity to mention some of the logistical points. First of all, the questions are going to be posted in our Q&A chats, and this is being both interpreted into English and Spanish, so you can select your language of choice. Just go down to the lower end of the screen on the right-hand corner where you will see a globe, and there you can select your language. This is going to be done live. You can also offer comments through, you just go into hashtag rethinking the future. And now let's offer the floor to Carlos Felipe Jaramillo. Good morning. Good morning, Josefina, and we convey greetings to Lima. So here from Washington, as you very clearly stated, we hope to generate in this forum some comments and reflections so that we look at rethinking the digital future. And I think, as we all are aware, this crisis brought on by the pandemic, the economic and social crises stemming from this, have been sharply felt throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And we are convinced that we need to rethink the development and growth patterns in the future, because this is a good time to reflect on this, where we were before the pandemic and what we need to change. So this is a top priority. And why? Because the pandemic has laid bare significant drawbacks and a lack of the use of digital resources, internet connectivity that affects a large part of Latin America's population. Unfortunately, just one segment of the population, a little close to half of the population of the region, has internet access. That population has been able to work from their homes. They've been able to at least continue their children's education through virtual platforms. They've been able to utilize public and financial services. They've been able to even purchase items and do business. Small and medium sized businesses, in some cases, have been able to make digital sales, and that's what's helped them to survive the crisis. But at least half of the population of Latin America lacks internet access, and this severely limits their resources and capabilities. I'm very personally concerned that this is increasing the levels of economic disparity and inequality that was already a problem in the past and will continue to be exacerbated as a result of this crisis. So this is a top priority, and I would just like to conclude by saying that we are fully convinced, and I hope this is discussed when we look at the digital future, in every line of effort, economically. We believe that digital resources are critical, also in the agriculture sector, in manufacturing sector, in the services sector. All of these are incorporating more and more digital components and resources. And also, the future jobs, I believe, are going to become much more digitalized. So I hope that we're able today to hear a lot of new concepts, ideas to help move forward at a faster pace in this digital transformation in Latin America, so that more people have access to digital resources, so that our region can maximize the opportunities that this digital future can provide us. Thank you, Carlos Felipe. Thank you for giving us that backdrop, and also the way you've urged the need for expanding digital services and closing that digital gap. Now we're going to discuss broadband digital services for all. So here we have Cristina, who is going to discuss some of the measures to create digital economies. Welcome. We also will have in this first panel Ivan Mantilla, who is Deputy Minister of Information Technologies and Telecommunications in Colombia. Ivan, thank you for being with us and welcome. Our first question is for Butina. Butina, the pandemic, as Carlos Felipe has already indicated, we need to close that deep gap, digital gap. What's missing so that we can have universal internet, broadband internet access?
Thank you so much for the question, and always happy to see the discussion around digital transformation, digital economy start with digital infrastructure. In fact, expanding broadband access for all is paramount if we are to promote an inclusive digital transformation, and in the context of COVID, resilience is important to have access to broadband connectivity. So the pandemic demonstrated the importance of this connectivity. It also exposed the depth of the digital divide, both between countries and within countries. So globally today, we know that nearly half of the world's population remain unconnected. 11% of those unconnected are in this region. So clearly there is an issue of an unfinished agenda for digital connectivity. And as our VP mentioned, risks for deeper inequalities if this remained unaddressed. So to answer your question, I think we need to focus on 4 priorities. One, we need to look at the investment needed to close the access gap. The second priority is to think at access at the same time the usage gap that is really profound in the region, and focus on policy, regulatory reform to get there. The third priority is to innovate and not treat the sector in a static manner, and look at the new technologies that will help with the access agenda. And then the last point is the importance of the ecosystem approach as we think about digital transformation. So in terms of the investment needed to connect the unconnected, if we look today at the access gap in the region, we see that the sector is maturing rapidly. And there was great progress in digital connectivity, reaching 70% on 4G coverage. So the coverage gap per se is relatively small, with about 10% of population totally outside of footprint of 3G and 4G. The situation is a little bit more complicated when we look at the usage gap, which is much, much higher. So if we look at those unconnected today, they live in sparsely populated areas of the region, including mountain ranges, rainforests, and islands. The cost of bringing them online is not insignificant. Also, it is very important as we think about connectivity to think beyond the mobile lens. This is important as we've seen in the context of the pandemic, the need for stable, multiple, simultaneous connections, as in every household, things have to be done in parallel, same for businesses. So in the LAC context, we must highlight an equal and still unachieved fixed broadband agenda, especially on fiber. On average, less than half of the population in the region have fixed band broadband connectivity. And if we look at fiber to home, we're still at 9%. So there is a big agenda there that we need to think about. So if we look at how we cover the bottom 10% of the population, the price tag for this, based on research done by the International Telecommunications Union with the Alliance of Affordable Internet, is $47 billion. So this is to reach universal internet access of 4G quality to 90% of the population. This includes CapEx, it includes OpEx. We need to look at least 50% of the population within 10 kilometers of a fiber backbone to reach this universality. This also includes 4G network, it includes backhaul, it includes radio, it includes OpEx. The studies went into details of that and shows that only 7% of this investment is greenfield. So there is a lot of work needed on upgrading the existing infrastructure. And as we look at the coverage gap, it's important to understand why there is an issue around commercial viability associated with serving the remote population. So we know that reaching the last 10% will require innovative business models, a different approach than the rest that was connected. And it's great to see that the region is actually piloting a lot of great ideas and moving from piloting to actual widespread implementation is very important if we want to reach this universal connectivity. Now, the second priority is addressing the usage gap. And this is a gap that is deeper and more difficult. Today, the region, the rate of broadband adoption in the region is 42%. And there are many reasons for the usage gap. One of them is the issue around affordability. Affordability is a big barrier to internet adoption for people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So we know, for example, that to be considered affordable, 1 gigabyte of connectivity to the internet should be at 2% of GNI per capita. Today, only half of the countries in LAC satisfy this requirement. We know that the bottom 20% poorest people in Bolivia, for example, 1 gigabyte represents 10% of GNI per capita. This is also important to look at it from the mobile ownership. So again, looking at the bottom of the pyramid, for the bottom 40% of the population, the cost of owning a mobile device is around 20% of income. So there is an issue around the use of the internet, the ability to afford it. This is very important to look at it in more details in a post-COVID context, as we know this pandemic will be pushing millions of people back into extreme poverty. So to address this, we need to look at a range of policy and regulatory priorities, thinking about how do we push competition to the next level, enabling infrastructure sharing so we don't duplicate infrastructure and there is possibility to drop costs because of that. The issue around available and affordable spectrum, and the whole issue around the rethinking universal access policy, reforming universal access funds, looking at the taxation. We know that 30% of the cost of a mobile device in some countries in Latin America is linked to taxation issues. So a deep thinking around policy and regulatory reforms is important to help with the usage gap that is a strong one in the case of the region. The third priority that I mentioned is innovation and thinking about the new emerging technologies that are out there that we need to see and we need to experiment with. These are emerging niche technologies like TV white space, hot air balloons, low orbit satellites. They promise to significantly reduce last mile deployment costs in remote areas. So it's important to continue piloting this and getting them to a wider level of application. And then my last point is the importance to think about connectivity within an ecosystem approach. A few elements to mention here: the importance of the trust environment. People will use the internet when they trust it. So the whole issue around privacy and cybersecurity is very important. Thinking demand and supply at the same time. And as Philippe mentioned, when we see digital opportunities in many sectors, that creates demand, and demand helps with the supply side issues as well. So I will not talk about this because I know these are topics for discussions in the future segments of this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Butina. Muchas gracias, Butina. Seguimos ahora por datos esta.
Thank you, Butina. Now we will consider, I want to discuss even further the ecosystem approach as well as the regulatory issues. You were talking about mobile devices in our countries. In Peru, they play a key role, especially for teachers during virtual classes, because large part were broadcast on television, but there was no interaction. Now, teachers can connect with students through these devices and have a greater interactive learning process. Now, let's also talk about the need for access to broadband technology. We have Vice Minister Mantilla from Colombia. Good morning, Vice Minister. We have a question here. In Colombia, you have a very ambitious program to provide broadband internet services to all Colombians. The first goal is that at least 70% of the population in Colombia gain access to broadband internet service by 2022. So what balance do we see right now in terms of the measures that have already been addressed, just so we could take stock of that? Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to warmly welcome everyone here, the panelists and our audience. And Butina, I totally agree with what you've already said. And I remembered the World Bank development study about 4 years ago that talked about the digital gap and also digital dividends. And you've changed a lot of what you've already discussed has helped change paradigms. And in our government, current government, one of our main focal points has been to accelerate the bridging of the digital gap and ensuring connectivity and providing public resources to those who most require it, that live in poverty, that live in very vulnerable situations, also remote areas. You have various economic strata that need to have these issues addressed for them. So, Josefina, I just wanted to mention the two key challenges overall that Colombia is facing?
Where there's a significant digital divide. Today, to bridge the coverage gap of internet service in rural areas is of the utmost importance to us, particularly in the whole region. As a matter of fact, there's a high percentage of our population lives in rural areas, and we can't condemn them to move to urban areas so that they have access to technology. And the second major challenge is today, I believe, and with regard to the upcoming years, is very important to sort as accessibility, or that is affordability of access in large urban areas. It's not a problem to afford network charges, but the problem is, it very simply put, is to people who don't have enough money to pay it in other areas and in urban areas. And that's the important work that governments can do to overcome this issue. So what can I say is the outcome from our program in Colombia now? The first thing, coverage, rural coverage. 2 years ago, we had 9.7% was covered with 4G cell phone coverage in rural areas. And so for this purpose, and to overcome this deficit of coverage, what we did was use a very powerful public policy tool, which is the radio electric spectrum. We changed the law, law 978. We enacted it and allowed us to change the digital history of Colombia. And so we used to assign spectrums based on payment, and that obviously at the level of the government, we understood that the spectrum to collect money, it's to rather, the purpose is to be fair in distribution of the spectrum. So what we did is the digital dividend of television and the 700 band as well, and so and broadband. And so Colombians today now have coverage for more than 360,000 rural areas now have coverage. More than 500 or 1,000 people are in each of these sites that we provided coverage to as a result of this change. By 2025, we'll have 80% coverage of 4G broadband coverage throughout Colombia. We have public tenders on this, but there's requirements that rural coverage be included to be awarded in the public tenders. And so we have made great strides, but the pandemic has showed us that we need it to be at a quicker pace. But we have a huge mobile telephone infrastructure project underway, and we believe with 700 band, it could be a higher coverage, but we're shooting for 80% coverage. Another important problem that I was mentioning is affordability. How to achieve that our countries that have such significant poverty levels that we shouldn't have to say, first, get a job, increase your income, and then when you have the money, you can afford internet. We can't allow that to happen in any country. It should be the other way around. That internet is what helps you to get a higher income because it helps you to get a job, etc. And so we have deployed an ambitious policy in this regard. Even though we've changed governments, President Duque's government has tried to reach 500,000 homes and provide resources to be able, from public coffers, to be able to provide 60% more people throughout Colombia to afford this access. Of these 500,000 households, we've connected 324,000 already, and we're trying the other remaining households. We're in the process of connecting these households. By 2021, we plan to do this. How have we done it? With two policies. One policy is to provide incentives for supply and the other for demand. The incentives for supply, what we've done is we have large public tenders where the operators who take part from of all signs, small, medium, and large, what we say with public resources from our universal fund for ICTs, we finance the deployment of the network. So we save the initial investment to deploy so that they have available a network in places, locations where there had never existed such infrastructure in municipalities and rural areas in Colombia. And with this, in exchange, we tell the operators that they have to have a social dues has to be paid over 6 months, a year and a half in exchange. Using this, we have been successful at reducing that a home that used to have to pay $15 or $20 or the equivalent, or 50 Colombian pesos it was, or 60, only has to pay out of their pocket 8,000 pesos, which is $2+ instead. And this has allowed connectivity in places that never in their life did they imagine or have any hopes to have access to internet. And additionally, we're generating a sustainability mechanism for the long term, because once this infrastructure is financed, the companies that won the public tenders, they have incentives to continue to manage and operating all of this infrastructure. Obviously, it's a business opportunity for them, and it's a job producer as well. The second project is incentives for demand. What do I mean by that? Well, this is very easy, this project. We can interpret it as traditional subsidies for programs that are targeted to places where a telecommunication or fiber optic network or coaxial cable program exists, but people don't have money to afford it because it's 60,000 Colombian pesos, and that's too much for them. So what we do is finance 85 to 90% of the fee so that they pay a standard social fee, which is 8,000 pesos, which is $2+ a month. And it's 2 or 4, at the exchange rate today, it's about between $2 and $4 a month. We've advanced, we've made strides forward, but these are programs we have. Colombia, in the first half of 2020, we've connected 660,000 households to internet. And with this public market dynamic and the private market dynamic shows that we have want to up the rate of growth and connection to households when it comes to fixed internet and mobile internet. Now 70% or a little more than 70% of the connections are to mobile internet are done through 4G networks. So those are the two major programs we have. To wrap up, this digital divide for persons, particular persons who live in poverty, the most vulnerable and the disadvantaged. But there's a gap, and this is how I'm going to wrap up, Josefina, that we, the countries, have to start look at for the future, and this is the entrepreneurship and innovation gap, how to generate technologies that enabling technologies so that this sector can come up with new business models to start a fourth industrial revolution in the country. For this purpose, since last year, we began the development of a 5G policy in our country, a policy that brings this leading edge technology to Colombia. And to be in 2022, we wanted to be kicked off or launched. It's not going to just be something sexy and say we have 5G now. No, we're going to use this technology to have an opportunity to develop new enterprises, new companies and enterprises that will generate new jobs and contribute to economic growth. This is what we began to forge this path, and we want to bridge this gap in our region and in our countries. In our country, thank you very much, Josefina, and to the World Bank for this invitation. And I'm at your disposal for any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Minister. Now, let's have a question from the audience that you've mentioned sort of, but it's a little deeper though. The question is, now, when it comes to regulatory issues, how did you create a regulatory framework? Josefina, if you would, I'm sorry, Butina, if you would answer that.
Thank you so much. Yes, so the regulatory framework is one that has to be based on how do we make sure that the private sector can invest more? So issues around predictability, issues around a good licensing framework are an important foundation for a good regulatory framework. We heard, I mean, it's amazing to hear the Vice Minister share with us the experience of Colombia, because there you see very good elements of thinking ahead and implementing and staying on target. So the issues around the digital dividend and the using the spectrum that is used for television, using it as a dividend for connectivity is a big project, and many countries are still struggling with this exercise. But here, very good example of how doing it fine and on time led actually to helping close the digital divide. And examples around also from the presentation around the subsidy on access and the subsidy to support demand. These are also very good elements. So I mean, the whole regulatory framework is one that evolves rapidly, and with the development in the technology, with the development of the business models, we always say that being a regulator today is one of the most difficult jobs. But having rules that at the end, making sure that the market works, if there are failures, there are responses to them. These are good elements for a regulatory framework.
Viceministro, ¿cómo están haciendo ustedes?
Vice Minister, what are you doing to be able to overcome problems with the regulatory framework? What are some of the challenges you face? I believe, Josefina, the challenges that the regulatory frameworks and public policy have in the country is how to first facilitate access to infrastructure and businesses, and how to reduce the cost of investment that has to be done by the companies, either private or public ones in our countries. Now, allow me to give you an example, a practical example. One barrier that existed in Colombia that was very important for deploying the fixed internet infrastructure with the cost of renting the electric infrastructure, posts, ducts, etc. The operators of telecommunications have to have fiber optics to lay, etc. That we corrected this with our law in 978. And we issued regulations for that law as well. And we were able to reduce the cost of that leasing between 55 and 70 or 80%. So what we see is that small internet providers and medium and large ones, it's much more economic to deploy this infrastructure. And this will lead to lower cost and better supply so that people can afford, and greater coverage, which is what we need. So if you ask me, how do you adapt the regulatory frameworks? I say these frameworks have to evolve towards something that there's not an excess of controls, because this is a service that we want all citizens to have access equally without discrimination. And what we have to do is make sure that investment in that sector is more economic, because this technology sector, telecommunication sectors, has become the sector that enables the entire economic development of the country. So we today have a huge obligation. 3 steps ahead we have to be. We're ahead of the rest of the economy. There's no health without connectivity. There's no education without connectivity. There's no jobs without connectivity. So that's why we say that the regulatory framework should be simplified, and we have to try to lower costs of investment and reduce the cost of the radio electric spectrum. In some countries it had, such as in Colombia, not long ago, it was a source of income or revenue for the nation, but no. It shouldn't be that. What we need more than that is people connected and not getting revenue from the spectrum. And the public tenders is what we did. We changed and everything. Minister Mantilla, thank you very much for answering this question. And thank you to the panel and basically for participating this morning with this exchange and conversation about rethinking our digital future. Now, we're going to move on to our second panel, which is access to digital finance. We are joined by Christian Tondo, Director of the Department of Financial Inclusion of the Central Bank of Paraguay. Christian is in charge of projects related to expanding banking coverage in his country. We're also joined by Jose Monjes Galeano, a commercial manager of Tigo Money, a specialist in electronic mobile payments in Paraguay. But Tigo Money has played an important part during the pandemic, as he's going to explain later on. We're going to begin with Christian. Christian, good morning. One of the weaknesses that has been uncovered by the pandemic is the high percentage of people who live on the margin of the financial system. So how is the Paraguayan government responding to the challenge of financial inclusion? Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation and the question. It's an honor to share this panel with other members. It's so interesting and worthwhile. Now, right to the question, how have we responded to the challenge in the pandemic with regard to financial inclusion? Now, after the bank took the liquidity measures that were necessary to support the financial system, and the entire usual package of measure were taken, but at the same time, with regard to financial inclusion, this has a high impact. And so what we did was implement the emergency subsidies to the informal sectors, which reached 1.2 million people who were not included in the formal financing system. For 1.2 million people is like 25% of the entire population of Paraguay. So by doing this for these persons who were in the informal economy, to allowed access to these private companies who provide these services, the ministry, what it did was we put it all together and we made a huge leap forward with regard to financial inclusion, because we provided accounts to 25% of the population which didn't have access to such accounts. But another piece of history that was made, if you go back further, and because this is at a talk at the World Bank, we can look at from 2011 until now, we can see that all the access to these bank accounts now, it's incredible. And so from the point of view today, it's pretty low though. But what happened between the 22% back then, and if you look in 2017, we have 49% people with accounts. So the regulation of electronic money allowed there to be a regulatory framework which to provide access to people who had no access at all to, as the Vice Minister of Colombia said, had no access to banks. What can you give people who have nothing? Paraguay of 2011 and 2017, bank accounts were given to these people. And if you look now at an emergency instrument that we created, or tool, it was sort of a wallet, so to speak, to keep money in and to use. And now it is the job of the private sector, which we're always engaged in conversations with, to support them so that these accounts don't fall out of use. And once we achieve that these people have these accounts and use them and make purchases using these accounts, the idea is to support the actors and to make electronic payments for these things so that they can continue to maintain these accounts active.
And these active accounts are only maintained where you're using these accounts, and they're based on an adequate regulatory framework. And we also need to link this with what Mr. Jaramillo said at the beginning of this discussion. I think that the future, for it to be digital, there has to be economic stability. Without that, it's really difficult to think that these businesses will be sustainable in the long term. They need these technology innovations. They need the infrastructure. They need the investment. We're not talking about 20 or 30,000 people. We have 3 million active accounts out of a population of 5.2 million adults. So economic stability is key. And in Paraguay, we regulated the digital and e-wallets. We now have stability, and that's stability is what I mean. What I mean by that is low levels of inflation, increases in income levels. So looking at it as an economist focused on development and technology innovation, we need to see that we're going to, are we going to continue to innovate, or are we going to provide stability so that these businesses can move forward and progress and avoid fluctuations as had been seen earlier? So we are focused on creating a reasonable, stable framework that is resilient to shocks. With the tools that we have, we need to continue moving forward so that we can extend the reach and include these populations. Thank you. I think you mentioned one crucial issue for the region. In the case of the pandemic and the emergency, how do you provide these resources who are the most vulnerable? For example, you talked about people without bank accounts, and I think that's going to be one of the challenges in the digital future. You talked about also the need to create a framework that will encourage private sector innovation. Jose, how about the private sector's perspective in Paraguay? What has been done in order to ensure that this e-money can also be replicated in other countries? Well, thank you, Josefina. I thank the World Bank and the audience. I think now we have been moving forward with economic inclusion and financial inclusion. So in order to be successful, let me just talk about some statistics relating to Paraguay and why Paraguay is the epicenter that then was expanded to cover other markets. And if I may, I'm going to switch to English.
How could I be invited to a webinar hosted by the World Bank and not challenge myself to speak English after taking so many lessons? So Paraguay is a landlocked, beautiful country in the heart of South America. Christian mentioned recently, we are 7 million people with 5 million adults, and average age is 26. And smartphone is used by 90% of the population. In the coming years, it is estimated that there will be more than 8 million mobile connections. That represents penetration above 100%. So Paraguay is very unique, and Christian mentioned that there are almost 5 million electronic wallets. And in economy with a GDP close to $40 billion, there is Tigo Money, my company, with an annual volume of 4% of the GDP, 2 million unique wallet users, and 2 transactions per second. So 2020 was very, very tough for everybody, and we played a leading role in digital payments with more than 1 million payments for food aid during the pandemic. And these monetary transfers reached 500,000 families at no cost to the government and free of charge to recipients. And people paid 100% electronic with their cell phones at merchants, giving government efficiency, security, and traceability. And these results did not happen overnight. Central Bank just mentioned this is a story of 10 to 15 years. And we started back in 2008. We were born with the idea of replacing pocket money in small shops with a cell phone. For example, buying a soda. And that idea was very good 10 years later. And now you see Amazon doing it in their Amazon Go stores, connecting the digital world to customers in the physical world with the cell phone in their pocket. Unfortunately, it didn't work for us. With a lot of effort, those years we only activated just about 5,000 wallets. So what was the problem? Perhaps we were looking to solve a problem where there was no problem. On the contrary, people were happy using cash. So that led us to re-engineer the services in 2010. And since then, we rethink the future. And we develop all services starting from 2010 with one premise. And how we did it, human-centered approach, customer-centric, passion for what people need. So we started to design products with a main attribute, simplicity. And Giros Tigo, the domestic remittances product, was born in Paraguay and the electronic wallet revamped. So that is how Tigo Money is around the world. With customer at the center, financial inclusion is increased. For example, Tanzania, where Tigo Pesa and the Bank of Tanzania distributes the interest of the trust account directly to customers. El Salvador, they lead bill collections. Honduras, they have international remittances in alliance with financial institutions. Bolivia, QR code interoperating with banks. And Guatemala, just recently, with a payment facilitator model with an acquisition use case for the unbanked in partnership with Visa. So in conclusion, wallets are key elements in the development of nations with positive impacts with adequate public policies. And all these that happened in Paraguay made us unique in the region and the first mobile money operator with the GSMA certification. So that's it. Human-centered approach increases access to digital finance. That's my message to the forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias, gracias, José. Tenemos entonces en este panel el punto de vista.
Thank you, Jose. So now we're looking at the perspective, the private sector perspective, and also the government perspective from Christian. And also, I think the public wants to know more about this relationship between the public and private sectors. And here we have a question from the audience, which says, what really required working closer together as a result of the pandemic? Christian, go ahead. Well, the need to work together, that was the real triggering factor. In Paraguay, there's a certain informal, a very high level of informal economy. And we saw very quickly that those people were going to be more severely impacted. And we had to recognize that. The national government recognized the high level of an informal economy. And when we were asked what we thought about dealing with, for example, subsidies, food subsidies, well, we were asked that, and we said, the fact is that doesn't sound like a very good idea, because it's a very inefficient way, and to proceed has high costs, and it's also prone to corruption. So then we were asked, well, what do you think about the wallets? Well, the wallet concept is a very good one. And I think, well, Jose's business alone has 5,000 points of sale. And there's we're up to 2 million active accounts with those wallets. So that was a very good solution to address the needs of the customers. Customers would be registered in a online registry that would have their name, their ID card number. They would register as users, potential users. And then that was through cooperation with Centers for Electronic Payment, we had a clearing process for those people who were going to be the main target of this assistance. And throughout the last year, during the pandemic, $180 million were transacted and distributed to 1.2 million people in monthly payments of about $85 per person. So in fact, for the population that was the people that were going to receive, they were going to benefit the impact. But although $85 is not enough to resolve all your economic needs, but at least it was some source of support, a very valid instrument, and it was a much more efficient way of distributing these benefits. Christian, Jose, thank you very much. And Jose, go ahead. Well, Josefina, I think that Christian very aptly stated that at some point consideration was given to distribute food subsidies with food itself. That was going to be a very high cost involved. And possibly they were going to continue to distribute food all the way up until now. And I'm talking about when the project started back in March. So to be able to connect this initiative between the government and the private sector, there was a lot of cooperation with the project. In fact, all of the electronic payments businesses helped to facilitate the government's tools. They provided a very fast as well as very traceable tool for the government. But the main impact was that we were disbursing these funds in electronic wallet where cash outs were prohibited. So we would segment the merchants so that people would mainly, buy food from the basic family basket of food and medicines. So people were receiving the food, as Christian mentioned, and we knew who they were, and we knew that the money that they were receiving was going to be used properly, and it was going to be used for the purposes that it was intended for. So that these e-purchases, they were cashless purchases. There were, for example, chain stores, but you also had mini markets, large chains and small markets. Sometimes markets in the smallest and grocery stores in the most remote areas where you don't have terminals available. So people were with their iPhones, the people were buying their food this way. And so the money that each user received helped to, it had a multiplying effect in terms of the benefits received, because people were buying food in their small grocery stores, which in turn energized the local economy, because there were then resources that were earmarked for paying salaries, especially in the middle of this pandemic. So I thought that this created a great deal of work, of jobs, and the small grocers were able to pay for the butcher bills and the bakeries. So all of those links in the chain they benefited from the impacts of these transfers. So we used the wallet without costs incurred by the government, without any costs incurred by the users or beneficiaries. So the money that was invested, had a whole chain reaction effect throughout the rest of the chain. And the beauty of all of this was that it was all cashless. We know that we've heard that Scandinavian countries have these kinds of digital economies, but for Paraguay, for our people, it was very surprising that, and Carlos Felipe, Josefina, the whole team from Paraguay saw that we have a lot that we can share with the rest of the world in terms of mobile financial services. Thank you. Of course you can. and a very successful experience. Working together with the public and private sectors, Paraguay has now been able to rethink the digital future as a result of this very painful pandemic. And thank you very much for sharing that experience. Now we're going to discuss the importance of digital education. And we know that in other countries throughout Latin America and in other parts of the world, children have not returned to school since March. So we have in this panel Heli Chavilan from the Estonian Education and Youth Authority involved. We know that Estonia has been in the forefront in making a rapid transition in this regard since the beginning of the pandemic. We, in addition to Eli, we have the CELA plan in Uruguay with digital education. We know that these government policies have transcended through various administrations. So thank you very much, Eli, and thank you for being with us. Eli, we're going to have the first question. Estonia has been recognized in being able to adapt to this digital education throughout the COVID-19. I know that there were previous efforts before the pandemic. You see this as a human right. So what challenges did this transition involve in terms of virtual education, such as a country like yours, where you had already made a great deal of advances and progress in the area?
First of all, good afternoon to everybody. And you are very right to say that Estonia has had a remarkable experience already integrating ICT into different spheres of life, including in education. We have had close to 25 years of gradual investments into the infrastructure, to the internet connections, to the devices. We have provided training for teachers free for close to 20 years. We have invested into the digital learning materials, integrating the digital skills as a requirement in the national curriculum. But yet, when in the spring, the pandemic was kind of reaching us, it was a challenging also for us, although we were rather quickly able to get the normal processes back to work. So on a national level, in terms of providing the support for schools, it took for us less than a week to put together the programs to support schools. And to be honest, our schools have been open during a spring pandemic, and they are open also now. So there hasn't been really a stopping of educational and learning processes during COVID-19.
Kelly, thank you very much. Gracias. Miguel, sobre el plan.
Thank you very much. Miguel, Plan Ceibal, what is the significance that Plan Ceibal had when you had to undertake this transition, which I understand it wasn't that long? You had it wasn't very long when you had the virtual classes in Uruguay. So what is it that's made this so significant, or by the way, it's Uruguay, that has made this policy so well accepted that it's made the transition from one administration to a new government administration? Well, when we started in December 2006 with the previous presidents, we focused on the need to address inequalities in the country. Frequently, we want to put in new technology innovations without knowing what problems we are going to resolve. So we asked ourselves in CELA, what problems do we want to address? During the first phase, we said to the president that we wanted to address inequality, where even the poorest households, children should have access to technology, the same as in the wealthiest households. So 9 out of 10 wealthy households had access to new technology. Only 1 out of 10 lower income families had it. So the first phase was a plan to increase access to devices and to technology. So of course, when all children have the same rights the same right to internet access. And this was back in 2007, 2008. We didn't have such cutting edge technology as we see today, but these children were already gaining access. So I always talk about the necessary conditions. If you don't access to technology for children, then you can't have other resources. So the next step was to say, all right, this project, which is a project to foster equality, is going to help and is going to be effective as long as you have technology, not just in education, but also expanding and replicating that in other sectors of society. And as the plan grew and expanded, we began to see various activities unfold. The issue is that in technology and in education, many countries, they just want to look at one piece of the pie. This has to be holistic. You can't talk about technology and education if you're also not talking about introducing devices, connectivity, platforms, new pedagogies, new teaching methods, new institutional designs to implement all of this. Because sometimes you ask the Ministry of Education that is basically focused on one thing, and now you're asking them to do something else. Here you have to have professors, engineers, pedagogic experts, economists that all work together that are in the service of education. Now in Uruguay, we had a very important situation arise. The president at that time, Vice President Vasquez, who he's an oncologist, he's a physician, and he was not afraid of taking on these risks. So in 2006, we took that risk to go down that path. Now with the pandemic, with regards to access, just to give you an idea, that it multiplied by 3 the use of digital platforms. At some point, we had 700,000 children connected to the network, doing their schoolwork. And today, we've seen almost a return to normalcy.
The other thing we must understand is that, of course, it's not just about technology. In Uruguay, there was a problem about how to teach English. What do? We taught English through video conference where the teacher was in Argentina, Philippines, and other parts of the world. That's also equity. That provides the ability to learn English to all children in Uruguay. And so from kindergarten on, they learn this. So books, it's much more expensive to print books than provide devices with books inside. So we have to look at how to resolve and figure out how to go about it. But one important thing, I believe, you talked about it in the first module, in the first block. From day one, we made sure that the educational platforms don't use up resources when they're working at home. And so when students are working on their mobile, we're trying to make sure it didn't take up resources. So we're trying to make an effort in Latin America so that this is valid for everyone. The World Bank has to be a leader as well as other agencies, because a lot of activities, internet activities, that we have to make sure that there's no that there's no consumption of the user if there's not support of the internet providers and the hosts. So we're talking about video conference, 1 gigabyte per hour is used up. I'm not going to get into all this, but this is one of the major challenges is using up to the telephone companies and governments have to deal with this, and the hosts and servers and service providers, Microsoft, et cetera, have to deal with how much is used up. We have to come up with a technical solution to do this, because in Uruguay, we've tried to do it, but throughout the region, the consumption of internet should not be left to the back and take second fiddle to teachers and students and their activities. And so it wasn't used politically to do all this. As I was saying, in the pandemic, it worked quite well as we had the pandemic, and there was a transformation. There's an important thing to understand at times when policies become partisan. However, when the population takes ownership of it, it's no longer partisan. It's a state policy, and that's what happened in in Uruguay. Ceibal project, what happened is if parents saw it could change their children's future. Thank you very much. And the outlook of this Ceibal plan in Uruguay, and what you mentioned about the data, here it's been one of the major challenges as well, but both teachers and students, the kids, are using the data plans from their own cell phones to be able to gain access to education, and that's it shouldn't be paid out of their own pocket. And so in this pandemic in the last months, but it's tough for to be able to pay for the data service. So now we have a question for the public. It's in English, and it's as follows.
Y en realidad para ambos. Did you provide
For both of you.
training free for all teachers nationally at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels? And given the investments made, how long did it take to transform the country into a digital economy? Eli?
Just to give you a few bits of statistics, in Estonia we have 15,000 teachers in general education. And on a national level, we have provided training for increasing the digital competencies of teachers with the annual amount of, let's say, 3,000 teachers each year. So, I mean, it's not something that you just train teachers once. I mean, the digital content changes, the new pedagogies are coming in, there are innovations. So you actually need constantly working with teachers as well as school leadership. And some of the innovative approaches we've used is that we have started to offer more like team-based programs for school communities, where you actually put together the schools where the digital competencies of the leadership and teachers may not be the highest ones. That's a euphemism. And on the other hand, you put very good educational technologies that work closely with that community, really have the demand-driven training, where they actually have also follow-up and they can get mentoring support during the pedagogical processes. So it's not just training per se, but it's more like a supportive services to help that mindsets to change, because it's very, very clear that there are so many different and very innovative software solutions available. And in order to take really a full opportunity what they are providing, you actually need a constant learning. It applies to us, it applies also to the teachers. So we've been working with the general education systems really systematically almost 20 years. Universities are very autonomous in Estonia, so most of them are sorting out their solutions themselves. But smaller universities sometimes also need some support also on a central level training and development structures. And then it's organized also in cooperation between government and the universities themselves.
Gracias, Heli. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Heli. So, Miguel, in Uruguay, how did this teacher training work for digital education? Well, in Uruguay, once we started the project, there was a process that I would call capacity building. There's a mistake, the way I view it, to talk about teacher training and all of that. I think that it's conceptually wrong to call it that. The analysis in our heads are that we have to, on Facebook or Instagram, that we have to conduct teacher training via Twitter or WhatsApp or whatever. But the first thing that we defined in Ceibal plan is that it had to be very understandable and practical and easy to use. It couldn't be like in the old times, they ignore, abort, go back. A doctor who uses an echocardiogram doesn't teach how to do this. It has everything is automatic learning there. So we emphasize the software that has to be used. So we created a capacity building network to see how the technology could help the teaching and what would be the best way, but not to see how to use a device. And this has proliferated at all levels. We have a lot of variety of courses for students and teachers. We've entered into an agreement with MIT to conduct a machine learning course for university students, which is different from the one in Boston, with local facilitators to work directly with them. But I believe that the topic of teacher training and new pedagogy has to be focused again. We have to on what we want the technology for. We want technology for it to be an accelerator for new pedagogy, and the students love to solve things with technology, but it's better to have a problem that ends up with a robot, and not put the robot first and then address the problem, but have the problem first. But I think this is how we've approached this. It's all been provided for by the state. Public education, and 85% of education is public in Uruguay, and the cost is approximately $100 per child per year, and it was provided for in the national budget. Thank you very much, Miguel. Miguel is from Uruguay, and Heli is from Estonia. Thank you very much for talking about your inspiring and instructive experiences. Good afternoon to both of you. So now we've reached the end of this conversation, and let us ask Franz Gross for the closing remarks. Thank you, everyone. Hi.
Exciting and dynamic sessions. I mean, I think we're in front of a digital revolution that's ours to grasp. It's been such a rich discussion, but let me try to pull out some of the important threads just as take-home messages from our many users. The first one is 79% of Latin Americans live within reach of a broadband signal, but only 45% today are connected region-wide. And changing that, getting to 90% effective coverage, means taking broadband to areas that are mostly uncovered right now, rural areas, and then helping people afford the connection. And both agendas are important. The good news, and Buthena brought this out, is this is not an unaffordable objective. This is totally affordable. The cost that Buthena mentioned, $47 billion, is over 10 years. So it's about $4.7 or $5 billion per year. That's 0.1% of regional GDP each year. It's not 1%, it's not 2%, it's 0.1% of regional GDP. So this is an expenditure item Latin America can afford and must afford. So the first thing is, I was very inspired by Ivan's explanations. Go Colombia. I mean, what an amazing success already that you've connected 700,000 or will have connected 700,000 people in such a short time. And I think that the key takeaway there for me is the combination of demand and supply side subsidies. In other words, encouraging broadband operators to move into unserved areas, giving them pieces of the digital spectrum, but against performance targets. You must extend the system into these poor and unserved areas. You must offer a basic data package in order to qualify for this. And you get public funds to move into areas that are commercially unviable. And then, of course, the demand side subsidy, paying those groups in the Estrata Uno, so the poorest group in Colombia, a demand side subsidy so that they can connect. Because without that, and this is another important point, affordability matters. Right now in Latin America, in Bolivia, what a 1 gigabyte per month of data would cost about 10% of the household income of households in the poorest quintile. So for the poorest quintile, 10% is totally unaffordable. Even in Colombia, it would be 9% of household income. In Brazil, it's 8% of household income. The UN Broadband Commission basically recommends that 1 gigabyte of data should cost no more than 2% of people's household income. But for that bottom quintile, we're looking at 5 times that amount in Bolivia, Colombia, Brazil right now. So we have to bring down those prices in order to get people connected. The next takeaway I'd like to point out is, imagine we extend the networks. We make sure that services are affordable for that bottom quintile. The next step is to make sure that people actually use it. And what we see worldwide is a lot of times we manage to get people connected. We even get them connected to affordable services. The prices come down, and yet people sort of linger at consumption levels way, way, way below that 1 gigabyte per month. So how do you get people really digitally using digital as part of their lives, not just subsistence usage of digital, but sort of using digital productively in all aspects of their life? And there's a couple of things that have turned out internationally to matter a lot on the demand side. One is that the handsets, the devices, be affordable. Uruguay, and Miguel gave us this example. In 2006, only 1 in 10 poor kids could afford a computer. Then Uruguay came out with a one laptop for child. This was a revolution under Plan Ceibal. And basically got it to where 10 years later, every poor child and every child in Uruguay has access to a laptop, has access to a device. When you think that there are still countries in Latin America where devices are 45% of the device cost is due to taxes. We, as governments, we have to stop thinking of digital devices as a source of revenue, of income for governments. We're basically taxing the wrong thing. We're taxing something that should enable people to get out of poverty and to allow them to thrive. So find a way to reduce the taxes to make these devices affordable for poor people. So one is handset affordability. The second is digital literacy. Ellie gave us some great examples on how 15,000 teachers in Estonia got retrained, 3,000 a year continuously to get them up. So this is a continuous process. People who have a device but aren't digitally literate are going to use very little of its power. And the last one, of course, is the social networking effects. The more services you run through digital platforms, the more people will be pulled into them. So Uruguay, vamos, tierra guaraní. What an amazing story to think that in Uruguay, in just a few years, I think it was between 2010 and 2016, Uruguay went from 22% coverage with digital wallets to 47%. Amazing, absolutely amazing. And then even higher in just a short time during the pandemic.
Hans, I think you're talking about Paraguay.
Sorry, that was Paraguay. Tierra Guarani, of course, is Paraguay. So with all respect to Miguel, amazing achievements there too. But the fact that Paraguay managed to go from 22 to 47% even before the pandemic, between 2011 and 2016. And then, of course, reaching 500,000 households with digital money transfers for basic goods during the pandemic. That's what I mean by these use cases. The more we can make people receive all of their social transfers by digital money, the more people will use it, the more people become digitally literate, and we create sort of a virtuous cycle of increased use, increased data use, and increased participation in the digital economy. So let me thank all of our speakers, all of the listeners that submitted excellent questions, and I think a very productive session. Back to you, Josefina.
Muchas gracias, Franz. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos.
Thank you, Franz, and thank you to everyone. And we hope to see you again in another opportunity to continue to rethink the digital future of our region. Good afternoon. And once again, if you'd like to hear this on Facebook, again, the World Bank Facebook page will have this stored. Thank you.